Well, today we begin a new book in the Prison Epistle series. As you remember, last year we looked at the book of Philippians, and today we're going to begin a series on the book of Ephesians. And so I've entitled my sermon, Grace and Peace to God's Holy People. Here you can see a picture of the old ruins of Ephesus in the sunset, and we're welcoming you to the church of Ephesus. Grace and peace are the words that Paul used to his holy people. Now, when we read about the city of Ephesus in John's book of the Revelation, we read that Jesus tells John to write this down and send it to the church in Ephesus. He says, I know how you have worked hard, and I know of your perseverance. Jesus tells John to write down to the people of Ephesus, I know that you don't tolerate wicked people. I know that you have tested false teachers and discovered who they are. I know that you hate the practice of the Nicolaitans. And the Nicolaitans were people who committed lots of sexual immorality and ate food offered to idols and practiced idolatry. You hated that practice. You've persevered and you've endured hardship and you've not grown weary. The only thing, says Jesus to John as he writes this down to the church in Ephesus, is that some of you, with all this hardship, have been distracted by your first love of Jesus. Well, we read of these people in Ephesus, the church in Ephesus, a group of faithful people who have had to face great difficulties in their Christian life. So much so that some of them have even been distracted by the world in which they're living in from their first love, that is their love of Jesus. In order for us to enter this story, I'd like you and me to go on a journey now. And we're going to go on a journey through the city of Ephesus. I'm going to show you a series of slides with a commentary over the top of these slides to help you and me go on this journey to Ephesus. So let's begin. Here's the first slide. I've written here, Ephesus was on the intersection of the major trade routes in Asia. It was one of the largest cities on the Mediterranean Sea. Here you can see this slide in the context. The bottom of the slide is the northern part of Africa, and the left side of the slide is Europe, and the right side of the slide is Palestine, and right there in the middle you can see that arrow is the ancient city of Ephesus. It's in modern day Turkey, and Ephesus was on the intersection of the major trade routes. Therefore, it became one of the greatest cities in the on the Mediterranean Sea. It was actually built in the 10th century BC by Greek colonists. Well, let's zoom in a little closer. Here's the next picture. Here you see Ephesus right near the coastline, and I've written Ephesus once had a harbour. However, each year the Klenner River silted up and eventually left the booming harbour town 5 kilometres from the coast. Well, you can see as we zoom in on the satellite picture that there is no harbour at Ephesus anymore. It's 5 kilometres from the coast, and that was actually what was the downfall, one of the downfalls of the city of Ephesus. The Klenner River silted up every year, and eventually it closed the city down. It slowly died. Well, let's get to Paul and the city of Ephesus, and here the next slide you can see that this is Paul's second missionary journey. Paul visited Ephesus for the first time on his second missionary journey in 49 AD. You can see there he leaves to go through Jerusalem, up to Antioch, through Iconium, up to Philippi, back down to Athens and Corinth, and then eventually he goes across to Ephesus. And we read that in Ephesus, Paul stayed just for a short time, and you can see all of this. This is written in Acts chapter 15 to Acts chapter 18. And in chapter 18, we see that Paul stayed in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. And before he sailed, writes Luke, Paul cut off his hair at Cenchrea because of a vow he had made. Well, Paul cut his hair off. I'm letting my hair growing. But we read that in verse 19 of Acts chapter 18, they arrived at Ephesus. Paul left Priscilla and Aquila, and he, in Ephesus, after he had reasoned with the Jews in the synagogue, they wanted him to stay, but he said, I'll come back if it's God's will. And so there you have the second missionary journey as Paul first arrived in Ephesus. Now here's the next slide. This is Paul's third missionary journey. This is about 53 to 57 AD now. Acts 18 to 21 was recorded. And I've written here, during his third missionary journey, 53 to 57 AD, Paul lived in Ephesus for over 3 years. So here you can see he started in Antioch, and he went up through Lystra to Ephesus, where he stayed for up to 3 years. And we read that again he went into the synagogue to try and reason with the Jews, and they eventually threw him out of the synagogue. And so he took his disciples and began daily discussions in a place in Ephesus called the Hall of Tyrannus, something that he rented. And for the next 2 years, he trained his disciples in the Hall of Tyrannus. So Paul was eventually there in that part of Ephesus. In Ephesus, he was there for 3 years before he moved on. Now, I bet you're dying to see what Ephesus actually looks like. Well, let's go to the modern day town of Selçuk. Here you see this little town in modern day Turkey, and it's called Selçuk. The modern day town of Selçuk, Turkey. The ruins of Ephesus lie 3 kilometers to the southwest of Selçuk. And if you look very carefully, you'll notice that I've put a red circle around this column, the last remaining column of the Temple of Artemis, or as the Romans called her, Diana. This is the last remaining column standing in the ruins of the Temple of Artemis, which is just a little outside the town of Ephesus. We'll come back to that in a minute. But there you have it, modern day Turkey. Well, let's go to the next photograph, and here is a picture of an old Roman map of the town of Ephesus as it existed back in the 1st century. And I've written here, the ancient Ephesus was a prosperous city with a population of more than 250,000 in the 1st century BC. It was one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean world, and that was because it was on a trade route. And it was a luxurious city. In fact, it had 2 theatres, the Great Theatre, which we'll see in a minute, and the small Odeum Theatre. In this picture you can see the Great Theatre. That's on the top left-hand corner of the slide. And the smaller Odeum Theatre is up the hill a little on the middle of the right-hand side, and it's covered. You can see that next to the marketplace there. Now, the main road that led down from the small theatre to the library near the other marketplace that you can see there was covered in marble. It was lined with marble statues, marble columns. And you get down to the Great Theatre, which you can see in that slide, and that Great Theatre goes all the way right to the left of that slide. You can just see a little bit of the harbour, this huge harbour that allowed Ephesus to become one of the great trading, on one of the great trading routes for all of Europe. Well, the people in Ephesus were wealthy. Let's have a look at this next slide. Here are some excavations right on the side of the hill in Ephesus, in the ruins. These houses are known as slope houses, located on the slopes of Mount Coressus. They were luxurious private houses occupied from the 1st to the 7th century AD. And so you can see here that people actually, you get some clues here, they lived in luxury. There was a lot of wealth and opulence in Ephesus. It was a rich town with lots of rich people. In fact, look at the luxury here. Here's the next slide. Some just of the paintings that still, the frescoes that still exist from the ruins in Ephesus. I've written here, these beautiful frescoes lined the homes and public spaces of Ephesus. You can just imagine, if that's what the walls look like, imagine what the interior of the houses looked like as well. This was a sophisticated city. And I want you to understand that the people of Ephesus had all the trappings of money, sex, and power. Let's go to the next slide. Here you can see another fresco in the town of Ephesus. Beautiful paintings in these slope houses, beautiful artwork and patterns. This was a sophisticated culture. And talking about a sophisticated culture, let's go to the next slide now, where you see the ancient library, what's called the Celsus Library. Here I've written, the Celsus Library was completed in 135 AD in honour of the Roman senator Tiberius Julius Celsus Ptolemaeus. It contained approximately 12,000 scrolls. It was built in 110 AD by Gaius Julius Aquila, who was the proconsul of Asia, and he built it to honour his father, the Roman senator, Tiberius Julius Celsus Ptolemaeus. It was completed 25 years later in 135 AD, and it contained about 12,000 scrolls. Now, before this library was built, you know there were collections of scrolls, because in Acts chapter 19 and verse 19, we read that Paul was casting out demons, and some of the sorcerers were eventually converted because of the experiences they had. And we read in verse 19 of Acts 19, a number who had practiced sorcery brought their scrolls together and burned them publicly. When they calculated the value of the scrolls, the total came to 50,000 drachma. How much is 50,000 drachma? 1 drachma was a day's salary. That's 50,000 days worth of salary. If you work it out on today's calculations, that's just over $7 million worth of scrolls that they burned. So you can see that this library, built later on, already had the makings of the scrolls that were being collected by many of the sorcerers and the other academics of this Celsus Library in the town of Ephesus. Well, let's go to the next slide. Here is the big commercial agora. Agora is a marketplace, and I've written here, the agora or marketplace was where all commercial trade and business was conducted in Ephesus. It was a very busy place. Now, Ephesus had 2 marketplaces, 2 agoras. The upper agora, or the state agora, was for the general public. And this one here, this is the lower agora, or the commercial agora. And you can see here it's quite a large space. All the commercial trade for Ephesus and all the business was conducted here. And as you'll see in a moment, it's very close to the harbour. The ships would unload their product, they would be brought here, and all the trade was made in Ephesus, a very wealthy place. And talking about wealth, let's go for a walk down the hill from the small theatre and the state agora down the hill towards the library. Here's the next slide. This is called the Marble Road. Leading from the smaller theatre to the library, the Marble Road was lined with marble columns and statues. This is going down the hill towards the Celsus Library. And all the famous people of the town, statues were made in marble. And possibly this whole walkway was covered as well. So an opulent, wealthy city. And then we go to the next slide here, and this is the road to the harbour. This is called the Arcadian Way. And I've written here, the Arcadian Way was the main access road to the busy Ephesian harbour. The harbour was slowly silted up by the Caister River. From the main great theatre and the commercial agora led this road to the harbour. It was the main access to the harbour, but as we know, the Caister River silted it all up. Now, if you go to the end of the road, you can see at the end of that road, all you can see is not harbour, but marshes and swamps. And in fact, the harbour now is 5 kilometres away on the coast. So it basically killed the city of Ephesus. After a major earthquake in 614 AD, that was really the decline of the city of Ephesus. But you see here in the next slide, the Great Theatre. Look at this. This is an amazing place. I've written here, the Great Theatre could seat 25,000 people. Its stage area was 3 stories high, and this is the place where Demetrius the silversmith opposed the apostle Paul. We read that story in Acts chapter 19, 24 and following, because Paul was saying that man-made gods are no gods at all. Well, the business side that was making statues of their goddess, Artemis, and Demetrius was probably one of the leaders of the guild and a silversmith, he was dead set against Paul taking business away from him. What do you mean man-made gods are no gods at all? That means that our product and our work is going to be ruined. And so we read that a huge riot ensued, and the people shouted out for hours, "Great is Artemis! Great is Artemis!" Artemis is the Greek name. The Romans used Diana for the goddess. And if you look at the picture here of this great theatre, you'll see in the background the main road that leads to the harbour. See, they're going off into the distance. That's the Arcadian Way. And of course, you can see there's no harbour anymore. It's just marshes and swamp. So let's go on to the next slide. Who was this Artemis that the Ephesians worshipped? Here's a slide and a picture of a excavated statue of the goddess Artemis. And I've written here, the goddess Artemis was the Hellenic goddess of the hunt, wild animals, wilderness, childbirth, virginity, and young girls. She is often depicted as a huntress carrying bow and arrow. She was the major god of the Ephesians, and she dominated the Ephesian culture. She was responsible for fertility, the fertility of people and the fertility of the ground. And here you can see this depiction of her and all of these many breasts that she has. And this is the idea of fertility, a goddess of fertility represented with these many breasts. Well, you can imagine that the goddess had a huge temple. So let's go now up the road a little bit from downtown Ephesus to the Temple of Artemis. And here is a picture of the ruins of the great Temple of Artemis. Here I've written, this single column is all that remains from the Temple of Artemis. The great Temple of Artemis. There's only one column that's left, and that's the column that I showed you at the beginning picture when we looked at the town of Selchuk, and that little column that was back off there in the background. Here it is. This is what's left of the great Temple of Artemis. But have no doubt, in its day, the Temple of Artemis was huge. Let's go to the next slide and have a look at a rendering of the Temple of Artemis. Look how huge this is. And I've written here, the Temple of Artemis, completed about 550 BC, was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It measured 525 feet long, 220 feet wide, and the columns alone were 60 feet high. Just the columns. See those columns? That is an amazing building. And of course, because she was the goddess of fertility, you can imagine that there were many temple prostitutes, both males and females, like in the town of Corinth, and they had a huge influence on the city of Ephesus. No wonder the church in Ephesus struggled with the secularism and the sexuality and the materialism in the town of Ephesus. And then finally, the last picture I want to show you here is a picture of St. Paul. Imagine this. I've written here, discovered in the cave of St. Paul. This painting dates back to the 6th century AD. If you go about 15 minutes walk from the ruins of Ephesus, up the hill, there's an entrance in the side of the hill. It's called the Grotto of St. Paul. And this painting dates back to the 6th century. And here you can see painted on the wall in Greek capitals, P-A-U-L-O-S, Paulos. This is Paul. And here he's preaching. The 2 fingers that are raised are representing him preaching. And the story is, the bigger picture, he's preaching to Thecla, who became one of his disciples. She was to be married, but because of Paul's preaching, as the story goes, she decided to follow Paul and remained unmarried. In his other hand, Paul has the writings, the scrolls, the scriptures as he's preaching. And even though this is a couple of centuries after he was there, other paintings of Paul and frescoes that we have give us a suggestion that he looked something like this. What a great idea we get of what the apostle might have looked like. Well, there you have a little journey in the town of Ephesus. And I just want to say that as he got to the point of writing his letter to the Ephesians, we realize that Paul caused a lot of trouble in the town of Ephesus because of his theology. One God, and his name is Jesus. Now, eventually Paul went to Jerusalem, and the people from Ephesus probably followed him down there. And eventually Paul was arrested in Jerusalem. There were people who he had upset again, and he was arrested, and you know the story. And he eventually went to Rome, to prison, for 2 years in house arrest. So this epistle was written around about 60 AD, just after Paul's 3rd missionary journey. And so we come to the text today, and I just finish with this. I wanted you to get a feel of what it must have been like to be a Christian in that town. And Paul writes in the first 2 verses of his epistle, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God, to God's holy people in Ephesus, the faithful in Christ Jesus. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. And simply Paul says here, look, I am an apostle. He's claiming that. That gives him the authority to write what he's writing. And he says that Jesus himself revealed his calling to Paul on the road to Damascus. This was done by the will of God. And this letter is to the people of Ephesus. Now, there's lots of debate about this sentence here. Probably in the original letter, the word Ephesus was left out, and the couriers went to the different towns and wrote in the name of the town that it was addressed to. That's what scholars think. But we know that this letter was written to the Ephesians, and it was probably written to other cities as well. And Paul says to the people of Ephesus, you're a holy people, you're faithful in Jesus, and grace and peace to you. Literally, he says that they are the saints of God. That's the word in the Greek. So I just wanted to say to you that, you know what, you and I have a lot in common with the people and the church in Ephesus. They lived amongst great wealth and opulence, and so do we today. We live in a very wealthy part of the world, and that wealth and opulence has become a great distraction from the gospel. They lived in a culture of greed and materialism and sexual perversion. Well, we too live in a world of greed and materialism and sexual perversion. In the town of Ephesus, the people weren't actually interested in real truth. They just told stories and worshipped whatever brought them money. Well, that's the same with us today. People aren't interested necessarily in the truth. And yet, Paul says that the people in the church in Ephesus were saints. They were faithful, and they were full of grace and peace. Well, that's you and me, the saints of Ephesus. Lord willing, maybe even the saints of Crescent Beach, full of grace and peace and faithful. I want you to be encouraged as we begin this new calendar year and we journey with the church of Ephesus. As they navigated their culture, we navigate our culture. And simply to say that the book of Ephesus has 3 chapters of theology and 3 chapters of practice, practical application. We're going to continue that journey. Thanks for starting this journey with me. We're going to continue the journey through the town and the book and the people of Ephesus. I look forward to that.